It is officially Fantasy Football Championship week. You guys got here, you did the dirty work, you made it to your championship game, and I got you guys covered with my top 30 wide receivers in the tier list format I give you guys every single week, going through my wide receiver ones, my wide receiver twos, my wide receiver threes, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays. You guys made it this far. It is go time. It is crunch time. It is time to secure your bids as your league's fantasy football champion. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decisions. Like I said, this is the most pivotal decision of the week. If you need help, leave it in the comment section. I'll try to get to as many as possible. With that being said, let's waste no more time and get into it. All right, before I get into the official top 30, as always, we go through the will they play tier, and this week's docket is filled with guys like Keenan Allen, Deebo Samuel, Chris Olave, DK Metcalf, Zay Flowers, Jaden Reed, Jordan Addison, and Courtland Sutton. And a lot of the information for this list was from Dr. Jesse Morse. He answered a lot of these questions, so if you guys haven't already followed him, haven't checked out his work, make sure you go do so. But to start it off with Keenan Allen, he is dealing with a heel injury, no details yet, and he's currently out for Week 17. He is not playing. If you do have Keenan Allen, be prepared to be without him. It makes sense. They're not really disclosing a lot of details. Justin Herbert already on the IR. Really just kind of seems like a tanking move for Keenan Allen. And the Chargers part obviously sucks if you do have Keenan Allen and made it this far, but he will be out this week. Deebo Samuel, wide receiver of the San Francisco 49ers. He is dealing with a sprained neck. He's been limited at practice all week, and it sounds like the Niners, for the most part, are just dealing back his workload, dialing back the workload. Obviously, sprained neck you don't want to deal with. It sounds like he should be ready to go for Sunday, and if he does go, he is a top 10 wide receiver in my rankings. Chris Olave, wide receiver of the New Orleans Saints. He's been limited at practice with the ankle injury he suffered a couple weeks ago. He played through it against the Rams. Shouldn't be quite an issue, but I do expect him to play on Sunday, and if he does, he is a top 15 overall wide receiver. DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, was a late addition to the injury report on Thursday with the back injury they listed him with. It really truly feels like an unknown whether or not he does play. I lean towards him playing. Again, you guys are going to find out more information whether he practices today. I'm recording this on Friday, or practices on Saturday leading up to the game. And if he does play, he will be a top 20 wide receiver for me going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Zay Flowers, wide receiver of the Baltimore Ravens. New calf strain. He's described by Dr. Jesse Morse as very risky for Week 17, and he's not sure if he plays. So big information. Obviously, Zay Flowers, big time performance this past week. If you do have Zay Flowers, be prepared to be without him. And even if he does play, I would limit him down the rankings to more of a flex play rather than the top 30 play he's been in recent weeks due to the injury. Jaden Reed, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers, suffering from turf toe and a rib injury. That's described by Dr. Jesse Morse. He describes it as a mild performance dip in the toe, but he should be able to return in Week 17, and that's big time news. Jaden Reed, if he does suit up, has a nice outlook. Dontavian Wick shouldn't play in this game. Christian Watson shouldn't play in this game. Jaden Reed should be occupying the number 1 wide receiver spot for the Green Bay Packers in this crucial divisional matchup against the Vikings this week. So if you have Jaden Reed and he does play, top 30 level expectation. Jordan Addison, wide receiver of the Minnesota Vikings. He suffered that ankle injury this past week. Likely to return in Week 17 according to Dr. Jesse Morse, but even if he does play, there's a lot of limiting factors here. He could see a performance dip battling this injury, and on top of all that, you do have a new quarterback there with Jaron Hall. If he suits up, more of a top 30 to 35 level play rather than the top 25 play he was at some points this year. And then finally, Courtland Sutton, wide receiver of the Denver Broncos. He is in concussion protocol. He is out for Week 17. If you have Courtland Sutton, be prepared to be without him this week. So now we head on to the official top 30 wide receivers, starting off with the 3 I will discuss in the 1 to 6 range. And the first 2 I want to talk about actually happen to be in the game of the week. Saturday Night Football, Cowboys take on the Lions in Dallas this week, 8:30 kickoff. It's going to be a fun one. Dallas Cowboys wide receiver CeeDee Lamb ranks as my wide receiver 1. Detroit Lions wide receiver Amon St. Brown ranks as my wide receiver 4 this week. And this is known as the chalk game for a reason. We are set for an absolute barn burner between these 2 high-octane offenses. This is the game of the entire slate. Highest over-under. Sharps on the over at a 97% rate. All of the money is going on this game absolutely shooting out, and I do think that ends up being the case. For CeeDee Lamb, he's currently the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football, and since the Cowboys bye week, he's been averaging 26.4 PPR points per game and 12.1 targets per game. He's a league-winning wide receiver. He's in a league-winning type of game environment going up against a top 4 matchup 4 wide receivers on the matchup chart. It's a no-brainer. CeeDee Lamb is the chalk, but I do think he pays off. I can see upwards of 25, 30 plus fantasy points for Lamb in this offense. Must-win game for the Cowboys, must-win game for the Lions. I'm expecting fireworks, and that just transitions straight forward towards Amon-Ra St. Brown. As good as CeeDee Lamb's been, Amon-Ra St. Brown's been good in his own right. He's a stud, 20.2 PPR points per game since his bye week, and he is commanding 9.71 targets per game in that stretch. Dallas obviously tougher against opposing wide receivers, but in the last month, they've been weaker against the pass. In the past month, they rank bottom 5 in terms of defensive success rate. It's been tough to watch the Cowboys. The defense hasn't been up there, and I do think the Lions are able to command points on their own right. This game's going to be fireworks. We could potentially see both teams cross 30 points in this game, and this is the game I want access to. I want the pieces, and the 2 biggest offensive playmakers on either side, respectively, are CeeDee Lamb for Dallas and are Amon-Ra St. Brown for the Lions. This is the most rostered game stack of the BBM final. Myself, I'm going to be watching intently, hoping to be able to take down the $3 million, and a lot of people are going to be following me in suit. Wide receiver 2 for me this week is going to be Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, going to play the Green Bay Packers at home this week. And with Justin Jefferson, if not absolutely for a smash spot with CeeDee Lamb, you can make the case he is the wide receiver 1 overall. Nick Mullins is out of the lineup this week. Jaron Hall is in. We have yet to see what the effect will that be on the offense. However, with Justin Jefferson, we do know that TJ Hawkinson is guaranteed out with that torn ACL and MCL he suffered last week. And even if Jordan Addison plays, he will be limited in this game. Jefferson, second full game back, 26.1 PPR points last week, 10 targets in back-to-back games, and now gets the easiest pass defense according to DVOA in this last month. Without Jair Alexander, it is a smash. If you have Justin Jefferson, you waited this long, you were able to advance him to the championship. Enjoy the spike week that is coming your way. But now we move on to the wide receivers 7 to 12, starting off with wide receiver 8, Puka Nacua of the LA Rams, going to play the New York Giants on the road this week. And Nacua's posted one of the greatest rookie seasons by a wide receiver of all time, coming off a huge performance with 33 PPR points and commanding 11 targets on Thursday Night Football last week against the Saints. I do prefer Cooper Kupp slightly, given the overall comparable usage the two have had on the field when together, but I honestly think both are league-winning level plays because of the play of Matthew Stafford. We know Sean McVay's a genius play caller. We know when Matthew Stafford's right and playing like this, the offense is one of the best in the league, and I think both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are in for big-time games against the Giants this week. The Rams are implied for the 7th most points on the slate despite being on the road, and even 25 points I think feels low. I feel like this is an offense that can get upwards of the 30, 35-point range against this New York Giants defense this week. They're playing too good of ball. Their playoff stakes are on the line, and I do trust my Rams going into championship weekend. Wide receiver 9, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs, going to play the Cincinnati Bengals at home this week, and Rashee Rice has truly evolved into that true fantasy football wide receiver 1 with the uptick in snaps he's seen. 55 targets in his last 6 games since the bye, and 16.89 PPR points per game in that stretch. Now he gets a matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, where KC is implied for nearly 26 points as 7-point home favorites, since he is the 5th worst defense against opposing wide receivers this year, and the Chiefs are coming off that big-time letdown game. Christmas standalone game against the Raiders obviously got embarrassed. I do think the Chiefs seek vengeance, and I do think that Rashee Rice is a big part of that this week for this offense. Wide receiver 11 for me is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans, going to play the Tennessee Titans at home this week. And Nico Collins practiced in full on Thursday and is set to play on Sunday in the return of quarterback CJ Stroud to the lineup. 16.37 PPR points per game with Stroud as his starting quarterback this year, including posting over 1,000 yards in the 12 games CJ Stroud has started. Tennessee represents the single easiest matchup on the matchup chart against opposing wide receivers, and the Texans are implied for nearly 24 points in the return of CJ Stroud this week. I'm expecting a league-winning level performance for Collins and for CJ Stroud to look fully back after the concussion scare he suffered 2 weeks ago. But you guys knew to start these guys like I mentioned at the top, so now let's spend some more time on my wide receivers 13 to 30, starting off with my high-end wide receiver 2s with my wide receiver 13, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, going to play the Atlanta Falcons at home this week. And he left early in last week's game against the Cardinals, but did return as a decoy. Only 6 targets, big blowout win against the Cardinals. I'm not taking much away from it. It does sound like he's healthy. It does sound like he will be back this week. And if DJ Moore is back to full health, I do think he has the opportunity to potentially win leagues. And a tough matchup against the Atlanta defense. They really do well against opposing wide receivers. That keeps him out of being a wide receiver 1 for me. But with over 20 implied points and a 29% seasonal target share for the Bears, I still trust DJ Moore as a must-start player. And when Justin Fields is in the lineup, we've seen DJ Moore ceiling. He's averaging 18.55 PPR points per game, multiple 20+ plus PPR point performances. I expect DJ Moore, assuming he's healthy, to get right back on track we saw 2 weeks ago. Next up at wide receivers 14 and 16 respectively, we have Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts and Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. Big time game. Raiders traveling on the road to play Indy this week. Should be a fun one, potentially a playoff eliminator game for both of these teams. So I'm going to start off with Michael Pittman Jr. The main question is how ready he is after suffering that brutal concussion against the Steelers 2 weeks ago. It was ugly. He was diving, hit to the head. However, it does sound like he is fully recovered. He shedded the red practice jersey, practiced in full on Thursday. It does look like he'll be able to clear for this game. And the Raiders matchup is quietly a tougher one than the surface level would suggest. This is a defense that ranks as an average matchup, but in the last month, they have been a top 5 defense in DVOA. However, the Colts are still implied for nearly 24 home points, and as we know, if the Colts are able to put up points, Michael Pittman Jr. will be a key figure in potentially getting them there. For Davante Adams, congrats to you if you made the chip after overcoming his Week 16 dud. He's been volatile this year. I mean, he has not been the same Davante Adams we have seen in the past, given the quarterback situation. However, the matchup against the Colts is an average one on the matchup chart, and I expect Davante Adams to be able to pay off after that dud. And another interesting tidbit is that both the Raiders and the Colts have been top 3 in neutral pass rate in the last month. It makes this game interesting. If both teams are airing it out, we could see more points than initially anticipated. Like I mentioned, Colts implied for 24 points. Also would not be shocked given their upset against the Chiefs last week if the Raiders came motivated with a potential playoff spot on the line if they are able to win out. I expect both teams to be playing their best football this weekend. Wide receiver 15 for me is Devontae Smith, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles, going to play the Arizona Cardinals at home this week. And Devontae Smith has been on an absolute tear since the Eagles bye week. He's averaging 17.5 PPR points per game, and he has outscored A.J. Brown in that stretch. Brown, in my opinion, is still the wide receiver 1 given his advantage in targets and given the overall player we're dealing with. But I definitely view Devontae Smith as a strong mid to high end wide receiver 2 entering championship week. Eagles implied for 29 points. Big time home favorites against a Cards D that has been 3rd worst in DVOA this last month. And I'm expecting this Philly offense to be firing on all cylinders after a relatively sloppy month from them. Wide receiver 17 for me is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, traveling on the road to play the Kansas City Chiefs. And he had another huge game against the Steelers this past week. He totaled 5 catches, 140 yards, and a receiving touchdown without Jamar Chase in the lineup. I won't sugarcoat that the matchup is extremely tough. The Chiefs D has limited opposing wide receivers all year, but T. Higgins has seen 8 targets in his last 2 games, and both being big-time elite performances that helped you get to the championship. He helped you get here. I don't have the gall to be able to bench him in the spot, knowing how talented of a player he is. I understand they're implied for less than 19 points. It is a brutal matchup given how good the Chiefs are at limiting wide receivers, but T. Higgins is a good enough player to flat out win his matchup, and he has that type of big play upside we covet with a championship on the line. Wide receiver 18 for me is Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, going to play the New Orleans Saints at home this week, and he's posted back-to-back big-time games after a year of struggles, 39.4 PPR points in his last 2 games, and double-digit targets in his last 3 games. The Saints have been very good against opposing wide receivers this year, but we've seen them be relatively shaky of late. We saw them let up a big game to Puka, let up a big game to Matthew Stafford this past Thursday, and I do think that can continue with how well Baker Mayfield has been playing in this last month. He's in the zone. Bucs offense much improved, and we're starting to see Godwin play like the Chris Godwin we know him to be. This Bucs offense is implied for 22.5 home points against the Saints defense that Chris Godwin has historically done well against, 19.4 PPR points in week 4, and I do think this is a good script for Chris Godwin to potentially win you guys fantasy football championships. Moving on to my low-end wide receiver 2s, we start off with my wide receiver 19 this week, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans, going to play the Houston Texans on the road this week. And it's been a disappointing last 2 games, but Will Levis is back as a full participant in practice, and we've seen him absolutely lock into Hopkins at times this year. 8.6 targets per game, 33 targets in his last 3 that they've played together, along with 15.3 PPR points per game for DeAndre Hopkins when Will Levis has been his starting quarterback. He was hurt in his last game against Houston, but we were able to see that despite that, in that game, Hopkins commanded 9 targets on Will Levis's 26 passing attempts. It's an advantageous matchup against the Texans. They struggle against wide receivers according to the matchup chart, and I'm expecting more points to be scored this week playing in that dome in Houston than we saw in the last matchup against Tennessee, playing in that Royal Ground in Nashville. Wide receiver 20 for me this week is Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars, going to play the Carolina Panthers on the road this week. And And the biggest wild card for Calvin Ridley at this point is the status of Trevor Lawrence. I'm ranking him here as if Trevor Lawrence were to play, but if Lawrence does indeed sit out, he will drop dramatically. So before you get to your comments, tell me how crazy I am for having Calvin Ridley this high. Make sure you listen to that disclaimer. This is if Trevor Lawrence plays. If he doesn't play, we're looking at a potential fringe top 30, 35 type of wide receiver rather than the top 20 wide receiver I have him in my rankings. The pros for Calvin Ridley is that he's commanded 42 targets in his last 4 games and is coming off a week winning performance against the Bucs with the Jags implied for 22 points this week. The cons are obviously the health status of Trevor Lawrence, but also the matchup. The Panthers have been stifling against opposing wide receivers, 4th fewest fantasy points per game, and are a bottom 10 matchup for wide receivers this year. With Calvin Ridley, he's extremely volatile whether or not Trevor Lawrence plays, but if he does play, I still trust him with low-end wide receiver 2 confidence. Wide receivers 21 and 23 respectively for me this week are George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks, going in that big-time matchup. Steelers traveling on the road to play the Seahawks this week, and with George Pickens, he advanced a lot of y'all who started him last week to your fantasy football championship. 4 catches, 195 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns in that career performance against the Bengals. And the thing is that the Steelers' passing offense has looked really rejuvenated with Mason Rudolph under center, and they now get a matchup against a Seahawks defense that has struggled tremendously of late. They rank bottom 5 in terms of defensive success rate, bottom 10 in terms of DVOA in the last month of the year, and they also represent a top 10 matchup for opposing wide receivers on the matchup chart. George Pickens is hard to trust given his history, but this is an absolute smash spot for him to be able to build off his game last week. And I honestly think wide receiver 2 level confidence, he's either going to be a wide receiver 1 or he's going to be a wide receiver 4. Because of that upside, I think you have to view him as a low-end wide receiver 2. On the other side, we have Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. He's coming off a big game, 11 targets, 8 catches, 81 yards in that stat line. And DK Metcalf, as I mentioned at the top, is dealing with that unknown back injury. You're potentially getting a shadow coverage by Joey Porter, even if DK Metcalf plays. So I really do think this could very well be the Tyler Lockett breakout week. Over 22 implied Seattle points. Geno Smith looked really good this past week against Tennessee. 2 touchdowns, looked generally accurate in that game after recovering from his arm injury. And Lockett gets the easiest matchup on the field at home. I'm super excited. I have him actually on my BBM Finals team. I hope we have a big week from Tyler Lockett, a top 24 wide receiver in my rankings. Wide receiver 22 for me was Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, who played on Thursday Night Football against the Cleveland Browns on the road. 10 targets, 5 catches, 50 yards, and -1 rushing yards in that game. Only 9.9 PPR points. So it sucks with Garrett Wilson. Obviously, if you have him, you're probably not thrilled with that performance, but it was always going to be tough for him to pay off against that defense. Wide receiver 24 for me is Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, going to play the San Francisco 49ers at home this week. He's back to wide receiver 2 territory with the news that Jacoby Brissett is starting this week for the Washington Commanders. With Jacoby Brissett under center, he's commanded a 22.7% target share on the 23 passing attempts from Brissett this year. And Brissett has been a big-time upgrade for the starting lineup and what Sam Howell was providing this team all year. San Francisco does appear tough on paper, but they have been susceptible to opposing wide receivers on the outside. Low implied total, but 49.5 over-under game environment at home is really juicy for this Commanders offense. I think they cover, and I think they'll be able to score points in San Francisco. I still think the Niners are going to win this game, but I view it more so as a 31-21, 34-24 level game rather than the 12.5 spread that is at stake. But we move on to my wide receiver 3s this week, starting off with wide receiver 25, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, goes on the road to play the Chicago Bears this week, and it's really hard to trust Drake London with how inconsistent this offense has been, but their playoff hopes are on the line across these next 2 games in 2 must-win atmospheres, and Drake London is still their best pass catcher. I can't excuse the underwhelming performances he's seen these last 2 weeks. They have been absolutely abysmal, but we've seen the upside he's capable of just 3 weeks ago. 11 targets, big-time game against the Bucs. Chicago's defense has been top 5 in DVOA and top 5 against wide receivers on the matchup chart. So don't get me wrong, the matchup is tough here. However, I am still trusting Drake London. Must-win atmosphere. We saw last week they kind of boat raced the Colts. 23 of the 33 pass attempts from Taylor Heineke went to running backs or tight ends. I don't expect that to be the case against a strong Chicago defense. I expect the Chicago defense to force Taylor Heineke to throw outside the numbers to beat him. And if one wide receiver is going to be able to do that, it's going to be Drake London in this game. Wide receivers 26 and 27 for me, respectively, are Deontay Johnson of the Steelers and Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Like I mentioned at the top with Pickens and Tyler Lockett. Same thing. Pittsburgh at Seattle. Love all the pass catchers in this game, but I mentioned the matchup factors for George Pickens, and you can also apply that to Deontay Johnson, but the reason I prefer George Pickens is that big play upside, is that ceiling we have seen from Pickens in the last couple of games. But I still think that Deontay Johnson is still a solid play. Both player status really just depends on how Mason Rudolph plays in this game, but no indicators off of last week would point me towards thinking he's going to struggle. On the flip side, JSN is another interesting bet. I mentioned it with Tyler Lockett having big time upside, but JSN also has it. He's coming off double-digit PPR points in 3 of his last 4 games and a 6-catch, 61-yard outing in that game he got banged up in last week. By all accounts, it sounds like he's ready to return. I think he banged his knee against the wall. That was the injury he suffered in the game. Regardless, sounds like a non-issue. Sounds like he's back to normal, and if he does suit up, like I said, top 30 overall play. We've seen rookie wide receivers have big-time games down the stretch, and I think JSN plants his name as the next one in line. Wide receiver 28 is Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers, going to play the Minnesota Vikings on the road this week. With Christian Watson and Dontavian Wicks expected out for this game, and Jaden Reed, like I said, expected to play, but still battling those turf and chest injuries, I think Romeo Doubs has a ton of upside with how good this Green Bay offense has been of late. Jordan Love's playing some very good ball. Packers ranked 3rd in wide receiver fantasy usage in this last month, and Romeo Doubs himself had a big game this past week, 79 yards and a receiving touchdown. 22.25 implied Packers road points and a high touchdown equity in this offense spell a very good game on the way for Romeo Doubs. I think he's able to pay off in fantasy football championships. Top 30 level play for me. Wide receiver 29 for me is Noah Brown of the Houston Texans, going to play the Tennessee Titans at home. And with Noah Brown, he had a rough game and a tough matchup against the Browns this past week. But the return of CJ Stroud on top of an elite matchup spells a great day for a bounce back for Noah Brown. Mentioned all of the matchup factors with Nico Collins, but Noah Brown has established himself as the clear-cut wide receiver 2 for Houston. With Tank Dell out of the lineup, I think Noah Brown has enough volume to go around. And like we said, this Tennessee Titans matchup is the easiest on the entire matchup chart. They suck against wide receivers. I think both of these wide receivers will ball. And then finally, wide receiver 30 for me is Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots, traveling on the road to play the Buffalo Bills. And with Demario Douglas, he's been banged up during this stretch, but since his role expanded in week 7, we've seen 5 of his 7 games in double digits of PPR scoring and 10.55 PPR points per game in that stretch. Matchup against the Bills D that's played much better of late, but Demario Douglas has really established himself as that true number 1 weapon for this Patriots passing attack. Game environment does lack for Demario Douglas, expected to be a sluggish game, bad offense, bad quarterback play from Bailey Zappi, but I do think he ends up getting there on volume rather than the situation regardless. He's a wide receiver 3-4 expectation in PPR, but in half or standard scoring leagues, maybe you downgrade him for guys like Brandon Cooks, guys like Gabe Davis that have that big play upside. But now we move on to my 5 favorite deeper league flex plays, and I mentioned Brandon Cooks at the top there, but he is my number 1 going to play the Detroit Lions at home this week. He's been disappointing of late, but this is a big time game environment at home with that high total. He's a volatile play, but he does have big play upside. Can definitely see him having, a 60-yard post route to the house in this type of game. I do think that's the type of atmosphere we're dealing with. He's very, very volatile, but if you trust him in your lineup, he still has a very high ceiling given the offense he's attached to. Number 2 is Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos, going to play the LA Chargers at home, and it sounds like there will be no Courtland Sutton in this game. And while Jarrett Stidham is indeed a downgrade from Russell Wilson, the Chargers have shown they cannot cover a nosebleed. This should be a potential showcase for Jerry Jeudy entering his final year with the Broncos potentially in 2024. I expect him to have his best game of the season. KJ Osborne, wide receiver of the Minnesota Vikings, goes to play the Green Bay Packers at home this week, and he has a prime opportunity against the worst defense in DVOA across this last month. Hawkinson is out, Addison potentially banged up, and I'm expecting the Vikings to score at will at home this week. I'm expecting the Vikings and Packers to be one of the shootouts of the slate. Number 4 is Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals, going to play the Kansas City Chiefs on the road this week. 5 catches, 59 yards last week for Cincinnati without Chase. Tough matchup in the slot, don't get me wrong, but the Bengals are fighting for their playoff lives, and I do think they're able to keep competitive with the Chiefs this week. I think the Chiefs are going to be able to score points on the other end, and I think the Bengals will be able to score points on their own end. I'm expecting them to keep competitive. They're a very desperate team, and this is the atmosphere we want to trust Tyler Boyd. And then finally, Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts, going to play the Las Vegas Raiders. 9 targets last week, getting his most snaps of the year. And while Pittman active could potentially limit his overall volume, I'll be curious to see if Michael Pittman is at full strength after missing last week with the concussion. This is a playoff eliminator, like I mentioned, and I expect both teams to show up, especially Josh Downs, the number 2 in this offense. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Like I mentioned at the top, comment your biggest starts this decision. I will try to get to as many as possible. And of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We will be grinding content throughout the offseason to prepare you guys, whether it's your dynasty leagues, whether it's your best ball leagues, or whether it's giving you guys that ample research going into the 2024 season. I appreciate you guys for supporting us throughout 2023. God bless. Good luck in your championships. Take care.